When we think of the Wild West, we picture gunfights, gold, and dusty towns. But hidden behind all that was something most people don't talk about: cannabis. Before it became controversial, this plant was everywhere. Doctors used it as medicine, farmers grew it as hemp, cowboys carried it for pain. But something changed, and that change wasn't just about the plant. It was about power, fear, and control. Why did people start calling it marijuana? Who wanted it banned? And how did a helpful plant become seen as dangerous? And how did it come into existence in the first place? This is the part of Wild West history that was pushed aside, a story of healing, survival, and the fight to erase it all. Before we start, if you love discovering the dark secrets of the Old West, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because what comes next is very exciting. Now, join us as we uncover what really happened with the Cannabis Cowboys. Early roots, hemp as a colonial staple. Long before cannabis became a hot topic, hemp was a basic part of everyday life. In the 1600s, American colonies like Virginia and Massachusetts actually passed laws that forced farmers to grow it. Why? Because hemp was strong, useful, and helped people survive. It was used to make rope, sails for ships, clothes, and even money. The first drafts of the U.S. Constitution was written on paper made from hemp. Even America's founding fathers like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson grew hemp. They didn't use it to get high. It wasn't about that. They grew it to help support their farms and the economy. The kind of cannabis that gets people high wasn't known or used much in these communities. Instead, they focused on hemp, the part of the plant that had industrial uses. As people moved west to build new lives, they brought hemp with them. It was planted in new towns and used in daily life. Hemp was woven into ropes for wagons, cloth for clothes, and sails for ships. It was a key part of early American life. Before it was ever banned or feared, hemp helped build the country. As the country grew, hemp stayed with it, traveling across the land, helping settlers, and becoming part of America's Wild West story. Medicine on the frontier. Life on the frontier was very hard. People had to deal with tough weather, long travel, and sickness without much help. There were not many doctors, and towns often had no real pharmacies. Sometimes the only pharmacy was a wagon that moved from place to place. So people used what they could grow or trade, and cannabis was one of those things. By the mid-1800s, cannabis was a common medicine in America. People didn't use it to get high. They used it to feel better. Cannabis was used to help with sleep problems, headaches, pain in the joints, muscle cramps, and period pain. The medicine came as a liquid called a tincture, which was easy to take. Big companies like Park Davis and Eli Lilly sold these tinctures in stores. You didn't need a doctor's note. It was cheap, easy to find, and many people trusted it. Cowboys who got hurt while working or got shot used cannabis to ease the pain. Women used it during childbirth when there were no strong painkillers. Back then, cannabis wasn't seen as a bad drug. It was just a helpful plant. People also used herbs like ginger or mint, and cannabis was just another plant that worked well. Because it was easy to grow, not expensive, and really helped with pain, cannabis became a quiet helper in homes across the Wild West. It sat in medicine cabinets and travel bags, ready to help when someone got sick or hurt, and takes us to when cannabis met the frontier. Stay with us, because this is where the story gets very interesting. Cannabis meets the frontier. As the American frontier grew and came in contact with Mexican culture, a new side of cannabis appeared. In Mexico, people had already been using marijuana for fun and in spiritual traditions. Mexican workers, cowboys, and soldiers brought this habit with them as they crossed into the United States, especially into places like Texas and the Southwest. This was different from how Americans had been using cannabis. In the US, most people used it as a liquid medicine called a tincture, but the Mexican way of smoking cannabis worked faster and was easier for some people. Smoking gave quick relief from pain or stress, and it became popular with working people, especially in border towns, mining camps, and among farm workers. As more Americans saw this new way of using cannabis, their views started to change. Cannabis was no longer seen only as a clean, helpful medicine in a glass bottle. It started to be seen as something used by poor people and immigrants. Some people looked down on it just because of who was using it. This change in how people saw cannabis also brought fear. As racial tensions grew in the early 1900s, many Americans became suspicious of Mexican culture and of marijuana. Newspapers and politicians began to blame cannabis for crime and bad behavior, even when there was little proof. So, what started as a cultural exchange slowly turned into a reason for fear and unfair treatment. And cannabis, once trusted, began to be viewed in a much darker light. The rise of Cannabis Cowboys. The idea of the Cannabis Cowboy began to grow, part rebel, part healer, part outlaw. In some parts of the Wild West, smoking cannabis became a quiet way to push back against rules from the East Coast and strict government control. It was more than just a habit, it was a symbol of freedom. These cowboys weren't like the ones in old movies. They came from all kinds of backgrounds. Some were Mexican vaqueros, others were black pioneers, native scouts, or white outsiders. Many were poor or had hard lives, but they had something in common: tough times and the small green leaf they carried to help them through it. Cannabis helped calm their nerves before a fight or shootout. It eased pain after long days riding horses or after accidents like cattle stampedes. For many of them, it wasn't about fun. It was about getting through the day. It was a tool they used to survive. But people in power didn't see it that way. As the West started to change and become more modern, cannabis was blamed for a lot of problems. Leaders and newspapers said it caused laziness, crime, and bad behavior, even if that wasn't true. Instead of understanding how it helped people, the government and wealthy classes made it a target. Cannabis, once seen as medicine or relief, was now called dangerous. And the people who used it, especially the poor and non-white, were often treated like criminals just for using a plant. A new name, a new perception. In the early 1900s, people in power started calling cannabis by a new name, marijuana. This wasn't just a simple name change. The new word, spelled marijuana at the time, was chosen on purpose. Lawmakers and the media used it to make the plant sound foreign and scary. They wanted to connect it with Mexican immigrants and behaviors they didn't understand. Before this, most Americans knew the plant as cannabis, which still showed up in medical books and was used in pharmacies. Cannabis sounded safe, like medicine, but marijuana sounded strange and dangerous. That was the point. It was meant to make people afraid. By changing the name, those in power made it easier to turn people against the plant. They told stories that made marijuana seem like something that caused crime, laziness, and madness. Newspapers ran headlines about marijuana-crazed criminals, even if there was no real proof. These stories made people believe the plant was a serious threat. This fear also gave leaders a reason to pass new laws and increase police action, especially in immigrant communities. The same plant that had once helped with pain and stress was now being used as a reason to arrest people and control certain groups. So, a plant that was once seen as a helpful tool became a symbol of danger. It was no longer just a medicine or part of daily life in the West. Now it was seen as a threat to the American way of life. But it did not end there. Pancho Villa and the Cannabis Revolution. During the Mexican Revolution in the early 1900s, cannabis took on a new role in history. General Pancho Villa, a famous Mexican leader, had soldiers who were known to smoke marijuana before going into battle. They believed it helped them stay calm, clear-headed, and brave while fighting. But in the United States, newspapers told a very different story. They printed scary headlines about marijuana-crazed Mexicans causing violence near the border. These stories made Americans afraid, even though they were often exaggerated or completely false. This fear helped change how people saw cannabis. Instead of being viewed as a helpful or healing plant, it was now connected to war, danger, and foreigners. Many Americans began to believe that cannabis made people violent or crazy. But the truth was very different. Pancho Villa's men were not criminals. They were rebels fighting against unfair treatment in their own country. Smoking cannabis was part of their tradition, not something meant to harm others. Still, these facts didn't matter to US lawmakers and the media. The fear created by these stories gave the government an excuse to act. Politicians used these false ideas to push for stricter laws. Before long, cannabis was banned in many places across the country. The myths and lies used to ban the plant didn't disappear. They stuck around for many years, shaping how people thought about cannabis, even long after the truth was known. Lawlessness and accessibility. Even when the government started saying bad things about cannabis, people in the West kept using it. The West was full of open land and small towns where laws were hard to enforce. That made it easier for people to grow, share, and sell cannabis without getting caught. During Prohibition, the time when alcohol was illegal, some smugglers who used to carry whiskey started adding cannabis to their loads. These bootleggers saw that weed could make money too. On faraway ranches and quiet farms, people grew the plant in secret. The wide, empty spaces helped hide their crops, and neighbors didn't ask questions. The Wild West had always been a place where people made their own rules. Cannabis became part of that life. In some towns, the sheriffs didn't care if people used it. In fact, some lawmen even smoked it themselves. But things started to change. Newspapers began connecting cannabis to things city folks feared: immigrants, jazz music, and urban crime. The stories weren't always true, but they scared people. The plant was no longer just a quiet part of life in the West. It was now being talked about in Washington, D.C. The federal government started paying attention. Leaders in power didn't like what they were hearing or seeing in the news. So, they decided to step in and take control. A big change was coming. Rules and bans were on the way, and the West's freedom to use cannabis was about to end. The turn toward regulation. In 1937, the U.S. government passed the Marijuana Tax Act, essentially criminalizing cannabis. The charge was led by Harry Anslinger, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger used racism and fear to push his agenda, declaring cannabis made Negroes and Mexicans forget their place, and turned white women into drug-crazed lovers. Doctors protested. They argued cannabis was safe and beneficial, but they were ignored. The law passed, and the West's long relationship with cannabis was severed. From outlaw cowboys to state criminals, cannabis users became targets. What was once survival became a federal offense. The seeds of stigma. With cannabis criminalized, stigma took root. Westerners who once relied on the plant were now labeled addicts, deviants, or criminals. Communities of color bore the brunt of enforcement. Black jazz musicians, Mexican laborers, and native users were disproportionately arrested. Cannabis didn't disappear. It was pushed underground, hidden behind barn doors and beneath floorboards. The West's open relationship with the plant became a secret. A cultural amnesia set in. People forgot hemp's contributions, cannabis's healing powers, and the cannabis cowboys who once rode tall in the saddle. Today, the Western U.S. leads the charge in cannabis legalization. California, Colorado, Arizona, states once haunted by prohibition, now grow cannabis openly, legally, and proudly. Dispensaries operate in old mining towns. Festivals celebrate the plant's return. Hemp is back in agriculture. The West never fully abandoned cannabis, it just went quiet. But the spirit of resilience, rebellion, and reinvention endured. The Cannabis Cowboys never left. They just waited for the right time to ride again. A history worth remembering. As legalization spreads, so does the need to tell the truth. Cannabis wasn't always taboo. It was once essential, woven into the very fabric of America's frontier. This is a history worth remembering, not to glorify drug use, but to honor resilience, to correct the record. By knowing our past, we understand the present and can shape a better, more honest future. Let's not forget the farmers, doctors, rebels, and writers who trusted a humble plant to get them through. Cannabis is more than a plant. It's a storybook. A medicine, a scapegoat, a survivor. It's the thread that connected empires and outlaws, soldiers and settlers. And like the West itself, it's complicated. From hemp ships in the Atlantic to border battles and modern dispensaries, cannabis has walked every dusty trail of the American experiment. Its roots run deeper than stigma, and its future is still being written. Cannabis stood beside pioneers, pushing westward, woven into their sails, their sacks, and their remedies. It helped build towns and treat ailments long before the word marijuana was weaponized. Its presence in early medicine cabinets was as common as it is controversial now. And while decades of prohibition tried to erase its past, the truth still lingers in records, relics, and in the resilience of those who never stopped believing in its power. Today, as the laws change and public perception shifts, we owe it to history and to ourselves to look back with clarity. Not through a lens of shame or fear, but with the courage to see cannabis for what it has always been, part of the American story. Its tale is layered, rugged, and still unfolding. And if we listen closely, it has more to teach us than we ever imagined. The Wild West wasn't just about outlaws and gold. It was about survival, and cannabis helped many survive. So what do you think about cannabis, and how do you think it transformed the Old West and the entire world? Which of these facts shocked you the most? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section below. If you found these stories chilling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories on the American Old West. Also, click on the next video on your screen. You won't want to miss it.